Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the channel, The Territory of Cinema. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like if you enjoy our content. Today, we are going to be discussing the movie White Elephant from 2022. The film unfurls with a quiet intensity centered around a group of men entangled in a shadowy enterprise. It begins with a palpable sense of unease hanging over a seemingly ordinary dinner party. We meet Gabriel, a man whose past career as a mid-level executive, perhaps in some forgotten sector of finance, now feels distant, replaced by the grim realities of his current involvement. His presence at the table, along with the others, signals a convergence of necessary evils. The core conflict ignites with the arrival of a figure whose history suggests a less conventional path, someone perhaps steeped in the kind of gritty realism often found in the B-movies of the late 90s, which might have fueled some early aspirations of the director. This newcomer is tasked with a brutal assignment, the nature of which immediately strains the already fragile loyalties present. It is a chilling echo of classic noir setups, where a simple job spirals into moral quicksand. The narrative then shifts focus, delving into the dynamics between these men, revealing layers of unspoken history and obligation. There is a quiet desperation in their interactions, a recognition that once they step onto this specific path, retreat is nearly impossible. One character, perhaps modeled after a figure whose early work drew inspiration from the stark cinematography of European art house cinema, attempts to maintain a facade of control, but the cracks are showing. The atmosphere thickens as the central act of violence is carried out, or perhaps decided upon. The execution of the task is not clean. It's messy, reflecting perhaps the director's own struggles to reconcile grand cinematic visions with the base necessities of genre filmmaking. The aftermath is where the real drama resides. The film turns inward, exploring the psychological toll. We witness the frayed nerves, the paranoia setting in. This isn't about heroes and villains in the broad sense. It's about the grim accounting between men who have crossed certain lines together. The tension escalates as the group realizes the consequences of their actions are far wider than anticipated. There are whispers of external pressures, perhaps from figures whose power is abstract, bureaucratic, echoing the cold indifference found in stories of corporate espionage. Gabriel, in particular, seems burdened by a sense of misplaced responsibility, a man who might have once dreamed of directing thoughtful character studies, now trapped in a narrative he cannot edit. The final sequences offer little redemption. The bonds forged in desperation begin to snap under the immense pressure. The resolution is less a satisfying conclusion and more a bleak settling of accounts. The camera lingers on the aftermath, suggesting that even if the immediate danger passes, the stain remains. A white elephant in the room of their lives, a conspicuous, burdensome truth that can never truly be ignored or neatly disposed of, leaving behind a haunting sense of inevitability, much like the lingering shadows in a meticulously composed frame by a seasoned cinematographer. The weight of the evening presses down on them like the oppressive humidity often depicted in early 1970s American thrillers, films that reveled in moral ambiguity. Gabriel shifts uncomfortably, his tailored suit now feeling like a costume for a role he never auditioned for. One recalls his earlier career aspirations, maybe a brief stint writing screenplays that were too nuanced for mainstream success, leading him down the more pragmatic, albeit morally compromised, avenues of life. His eyes dart towards Michael, whose silence is more menacing than any outburst. Michael, the enforcer, carries the quiet authority of someone whose entire life has been structured around the execution of unpleasant necessities, perhaps channeling the stoicism of old Western anti-heroes, where loyalty was the only currency that mattered. The introduction of the problem, the individual they must deal with, is handled with a chilling lack of preamble. It's done over lukewarm coffee, transforming the mundane into the macabre. This moment exposes the fragility of their camaraderie. These men are bound not by affection, but by shared complicity. The dialogue becomes clipped, stripped down to functional imperatives, much like the stark, underwritten scripts favored by certain minimalist directors whose work prizes subtext over exposition. As the plan solidifies, a brief, almost imperceptible moment of doubt flickers across the face of David, the younger member of the circle. David, whose ambition might have once seen him working on slick, high-production value television dramas, now finds himself entangled in something low and dirty. His inexperience translates into a nervous energy that the others try to suppress, recognizing that such visible anxiety is a liability. It's the tension between the professional veneer they attempt to project and the raw, primal fear simmering beneath that provides the film's true texture. The ensuing events unfold with a dreadful sense of inevitability, less like a sudden explosion and more like a slow, controlled implosion. When the inevitable violence occurs, it is portrayed not with stylized flair, but with a grim, almost documentary-like focus on the physical and emotional fallout. The camera lingers uncomfortably on the small, telling details: the shaking hands, the labored breathing, the way the light reflects dully off spilled liquid. These are the moments where the narrative transcends mere genre exercise, hinting at the filmmaker's aspiration to capture the suffocating psychological realism often found in the later works of European masters who explored the limits of human endurance. Following the action, the atmosphere is thick with unspoken accusation. Trust, already a commodity in short supply, evaporates entirely. They retreat into their separate islands of guilt and self-preservation. Gabriel attempts to rationalize, dredging up old arguments about necessity and survival, echoes of past philosophical debates he once enjoyed, now rendered meaningless against the backdrop of their current reality. The film suggests that the true horror isn't the act itself, but the permanent alteration it causes within the perpetrators, turning familiar faces into hostile strangers overnight. The sense of isolation, even when they are physically proximate, becomes the dominating emotion, a chilling testament to the corrosive power of shared transgression. The aftermath spirals into a labyrinth of strained communication, each man constructing his own narrative of self-exoneration, a process that only serves to further isolate him. Michael, the bedrock of their grim operation, starts exhibiting signs of fatigue, a subtle slump in his otherwise rigid posture. He is a man built for action, not for the endless contemplation that guilt demands. His inspiration seems drawn from the hard-boiled detectives of classic American literature, men who understood the rules of the street but rarely the complexities of the soul. His stoicism begins to crack, revealing a core of exhaustion that suggests he has been enacting this grim choreography for too long. David, meanwhile, becomes volatile. The initial fear hardens into a brittle anger, directed outward as a shield against the self-loathing within. He paces their temporary sanctuary, a poorly lit, anonymous space that feels deliberately designed to mirror the emptiness of their prospects, perhaps reflecting the director's own early fascination with confined spaces from low-budget stage plays. He demands certainty where none can exist, clashing sharply with Gabriel, who tries desperately to impose order through bureaucratic language, clinging to the vestiges of his former corporate life. Gabriel's obsession with process, checking timelines, reviewing non-existent protocols, is a pathetic attempt to recapture a world where consequences were measurable and manageable, not existential. A crucial scene involves a tense, late-night meeting where the external pressures, the true puppet masters of their situation, are only vaguely alluded to. These figures are painted as faceless entities of immense impersonal power, reminiscent of the abstract threats in political thrillers that examine the nature of institutional corruption. The communication from them is brief, delivered via encrypted messages or through intermediaries who refuse eye contact, underscoring the disposable nature of the men in the room. This lack of direct human accountability frees the higher powers, but condemns the foot soldiers to a perpetual state of paranoia. The emotional core of the film tightens around a misplaced object or a forgotten detail from the event. A single misplaced clue that acts as the titular white elephant, an undeniable physical manifestation of their secret that demands constant nerve-wracking management. This object becomes the focus of their growing distrust. Is one of them going to use it? Is someone already compromised? The atmosphere shifts from shared panic to active suspicion among themselves. The film's resolution avoids a clean shootout or a dramatic arrest. Instead, it drifts toward a quiet dissolution. One character makes a choice, not a heroic one, but a pragmatic survivalist maneuver that severs one more tie. The final moments focus on Gabriel, who is left alone, perhaps in the remnants of his former respectable life, now tainted beyond recognition. He looks out a window, not seeking escape, but simply observing the routine of the world continuing without him. The lingering shot captures the profound emptiness of a life reduced to managing the fallout of one bad decision, leaving the audience with the chilling realization that the most devastating prison is often the one built from one's own compromised choices. The silence in Gabriel's final scene is heavy, saturated with the unspoken history of their shared crime. His apartment, once perhaps a symbol of achieved middle-class aspiration, now feels sterile and accusatory, much like the stark, minimalist interiors favored by directors focused on psychological decay rather than elaborate set design. He moves slowly, the physical manifestation of deep spiritual exhaustion, the memories of his younger self, the one who dreamed of crafting intricate narratives, now seem like the fantasies of a naive stranger. This quietude is far more damning than any dramatic confrontation. It's the sound of a man realizing that the scaffolding of his respectable life has been entirely hollowed out. Michael's departure is starkly different. He doesn't linger for introspection. His exit is abrupt, a clean break necessitated by his own rigid code, perhaps one instilled during a past life spent in highly structured, high-risk environments, maybe military logistics or specialized security contracting, fields that prize efficiency above all else. He leaves behind only the faint scent of stale cigarette smoke and the absolute certainty that he will never be seen by them again. For Michael, survival isn't about comfort. It's about erasing the paper trail, a relentless pursuit of operational closure that leaves no room for sentimentality. David's fate is perhaps the most tragic, because it's rooted in unfulfilled potential colliding violently with immediate danger. Consumed by his erratic fear, he attempts one final, desperate act of self-salvation, a move based on flawed intelligence and panicked impulse, mirroring the kind of amateur mistake often seen in cautionary tales about new recruits in dangerous organizations. This final miscalculation leads not to dramatic gunfire, but to a lonely, anticlimactic disappearance, swallowed by the very anonymity they sought to exploit. His story serves as a grim warning about the danger of mistaking ambition for competence in morally gray territories. The white elephant, that burdensome truth, remains with Gabriel, less an object now, and more a permanent internal resident. It manifests as a hyper-awareness of mundane details, the time the mail arrives, the precise shade of the morning light, the casual laughter of neighbors, all of which now sound like mockeries of normalcy. The film concludes not with a bang, but with the lingering, chilling sense that this is not an ending, but merely a pause in an ongoing sentence. Gabriel is left navigating a reality where every decision is filtered through the lens of past transgression, a permanent exile within his own life, a poignant reflection of the enduring shadow cast by acts committed when one believes they are operating outside the reach of consequence. The entire experience is depicted with a muted palette, as if the vibrancy has been literally leached out of the world by the grim transactions that took place. the aftermath settles into a pervasive, low-frequency hum of anxiety, a constant companion that replaces the sharp adrenaline spikes of immediate danger. Gabriel finds himself reverting to the routines of his former, cleaner existence, but every action is now overlaid with a grim irony. He meticulously organizes his bookshelves, a habit perhaps picked up during a brief idealistic phase where he admired authors known for their exhaustive research and structured prose. Now, this meticulousness is a frantic attempt to impose order on internal chaos. He notices the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, these tiny, unconcerned particles mirroring the insignificance of their grand, catastrophic plan against the vast indifference of the world. The film suggests that the true horror lies in the mundane persistence of life continuing around them. A brief scene shows Gabriel at a local market, observing a family laughing over a simple purchase. The sheer, uncomplicated joy of the moment acts like an abrasive against his consciousness, forcing him to confront the chasm between the reality he inhabits and the one he forfeited. This isn't the catharsis of a moral awakening, but the dull ache of permanent separation. His past aspirations, perhaps to direct films that explored the quiet dignity of ordinary struggle, inspired by early neo-realist cinema, now feel like cruel jokes played by fate. There is no formal reckoning, no cinematic grand jury. Instead, the narrative focuses on the slow, bureaucratic erosion of possibility. Letters arrive, bills, circulars, seemingly innocuous official correspondence, each one demanding engagement with a system Gabriel can no longer fully trust or participate in without fear. The weight of the unspoken promise made to those higher up, the entities only glimpsed in shadows, hangs heavy. This echoes the chilling, often implied threats in espionage narratives where the threat is not immediate violence, but permanent erasure from the functional world. The story subtly shifts to the periphery, hinting at the fate of those peripheral figures who facilitated the operation. A brief, almost documentary-like insert shows a transient location, a dilapidated warehouse or a forgotten garage, being systematically cleaned, sterilized. This suggests the unseen machinery of power is efficient and utterly impersonal, capable of scrubbing away all traces of the human mess the main characters left behind. It underscores that while Gabriel, Michael, and David were forced to carry the emotional burden, their usefulness to the larger structure has already been concluded and catalogued. The final note is one of profound, inescapable isolation. Gabriel is not imprisoned by bars, but by memory and paranoia. He avoids mirrors, unable to reconcile the reflection with the actions committed. The film closes on a sustained shot of an empty street corner at dusk, suggesting that while the immediate threat might have passed, the stain of the white elephant, the knowledge of what they are capable of, is now woven into the very fabric of their being, rendering any future moment of peace impossible. It is a testament to the director's vision of depicting consequence not as a sudden punitive event, but as a slow, inescapable poisoning of the self. The lingering quietude that follows the unraveling of their desperate alliance is characterized by a sense of profound disorientation. Gabriel retreats further into a shell of routine, a desperate mimicry of normalcy. He begins cultivating an almost obsessive focus on sound, listening intently to the ordinary noises of his building, the distant rumble of traffic, the muffled conversations from adjacent apartments. This hypervigilance is a direct inheritance from the high-stakes paranoia instilled during the enterprise, an echo of the tense operational security protocols he was forced to adhere to. His internal landscape mirrors the stripped-down aesthetic of the bleak, post-apocalyptic narratives he once dismissed as overly simplistic. Now, his world has been reduced to the bare essentials of hiding in plain sight. Michael, true to his nature, achieves a kind of functional invisibility. There are no lingering shots of his remorse or his attempts at new beginnings. Instead, the film offers fragmented, almost mythical glimpses of his continued movement. Perhaps an anonymous tip suggests he resurfaced briefly in a distant, unremarkable city, working a job requiring absolute discretion, maybe managing inventory in a vast windowless distribution center, a task requiring the same kind of detached precision he once applied to more violent endeavors. His story becomes an urban legend among the remnants of their network, a testament to the survival of pure functionality divorced from morality. He is the ultimate testament to the idea that some men are built purely to execute, and in executing, they find a twisted form of self-definition that requires no introspection. David's unresolved status haunts the narrative more actively than Michael's clean disappearance. His youthful eagerness, once seen as a liability, now seems like the symptom of a deeper tragedy, a life prematurely extinguished by ambition in the wrong arena. There are suggestions, subtle visual cues left for the keen-eyed viewer that he didn't simply vanish but was absorbed by the larger, more indifferent mechanism they served. A discarded piece of identification or a familiar, cheap electronic device found in an unexpected location implies that the system that required his silence was more comprehensive than even the trio realized. It is a chilling reminder of the cold, bureaucratic reach that inspired the cynical tone of many socio-political thrillers the director admired in his formative years. The white elephant in Gabriel's life evolves from a secret crime to a fundamental alteration of perception. He starts to view social interaction through the lens of interrogation. Every casual question is parsed for hidden meaning, every compliment suspected of being a trap. This inability to trust the inherent goodness or randomness of everyday life is the film's final commentary on the cost of their venture. The brief, fleeting shots of nature, a tree shedding its leaves, rain washing the sidewalk, are rendered meaningless, failing to offer the solace they might have promised in an earlier, more innocent lifetime. The film concludes not on a note of suspense, but on the suffocating realization that for Gabriel, the performance of living must now continue indefinitely. A solitary actor on a stage that has been stripped bare of all meaningful context. The final act of stillness surrounding Gabriel is not peace, but a state of protracted suspension, a living death in the midst of the mundane. His apartment, bathed in the unforgiving pale light of a mid-morning, feels less like a home and more like a meticulously maintained holding cell. He has become an expert in absence, mastering the art of taking up as little physical and emotional space as possible. This deliberate minimization of self is a perverse extension of the operational discipline drilled into him. If you cannot be erased, at least be unremarkable. His earlier life, the one filled with the faint promise of success in finance, now seems like a poorly written first draft, a version of himself he brutally edited out. The absence of Michael and David creates a vast, echoing chamber in Gabriel's mind, populated only by their phantom arguments and shared glances of dread. Michael's efficiency in vanishing is perhaps the cruelest irony. He successfully executed the final necessary task, which was severing all ties to his past colleagues. This echoes the pragmatic, unsentimental approach seen in certain war films where comrades are left behind not out of malice, but out of strategic necessity. For Michael, morality was always secondary to mission completion, a trait that ironically secured his survival, even if it meant perpetual solitude. David's memory is more torturous for Gabriel because it is unresolved, a loose thread in an otherwise catastrophic tapestry. Gabriel occasionally finds himself checking news feeds for obscure reports of unidentified bodies or small localized incidents, a grim digital archaeology undertaken not to find David, but to confirm the finality of his absence. This anxious searching is a direct contradiction of the necessity to remain invisible, a secret compulsion that threatens to expose him. It speaks to a buried piece of his own conscience, the last shred of connection to the man who still possessed the capacity for raw, undisciplined fear. The white elephant has metastasized. It is no longer just the secret act, but the pervasive atmosphere of unreality that colors every moment. When Gabriel attempts to engage in simple tasks, like making coffee or sorting mail, his movements are hesitant, as if he expects the inanimate objects themselves to betray him. This psychological fragmentation recalls the intense focus on unreliable narration found in early existential cinema, where the protagonist's very perception is the ultimate unreliable source. He is haunted by the realization that the men who orchestrated this, the faceless superiors, are likely already discussing the next necessary cleanup job with completely new players. The film denies the audience any cathartic confrontation. There is no final showdown, no moment where Gabriel rises to meet his fate with dignity. Instead, the final sequence is profoundly anticlimactic. Gabriel is observed sitting perfectly still, perhaps for hours, staring at a blank wall. The camera pulls back slowly, isolating him in the frame, emphasizing the enormous, oppressive space of his self-imposed prison. The implication is clear. The consequences of the white elephant are not handcuffs or prison cells, but a permanent state of internal exile, a life lived perpetually under the weight of a terrible, unshareable truth. The world outside continues, indifferent, but for Gabriel, the soundtrack of life has been permanently muted, replaced by the low drone of irreversible damage. The muted world Gabriel now inhabits demands a specific kind of performance, the act of being unremarkable. He navigates his days with the precision of a bomb disposal expert, knowing that any deviation from the expected pattern could trigger the silent, invisible forces still monitoring the fallout. This constant self-censorship drains him, replacing the active stress of the crime with the chronic fatigue of sustained deception. He no longer thinks about changing his life. He only thinks about maintaining the current, precarious illusion of stability. This echoes the narrative style of certain late-career directors who focused less on action and more on the slow decay of the human spirit under systemic pressure. The remnants of his ambition manifest in strange, almost pathetic ways. He occasionally opens a laptop, not to search for information, but to stare at old, half-finished documents, perhaps a complex financial model he once prided himself on, or a philosophical essay on ethics. These artifacts from a former self are untouchable, relics from a timeline that no longer accommodates him. He touches the screen briefly, a phantom limb sensation for a life that died the moment he agreed to the dinner party. The film subtly explores the idea that the infrastructure of their world, the banks, the corporations, the invisible lines of authority, is the true antagonist. These forces are immune to guilt and consequence, operating on a scale that renders individual moral failings insignificant, except as necessary collateral. Gabriel suspects that the men who hired them are already insulated, perhaps enjoying vacations or overseeing entirely different operations, utterly untroubled by the messy conclusion of the white elephant incident. This impersonal cruelty is the ultimate betrayal, more damaging than any direct threat. His few remaining interactions are transactional and brief. When forced to speak to a neighbor or a clerk, his voice is pitched slightly too low, his gaze deliberately unfocused, techniques learned for minimizing attention in hostile environments. He has mastered the art of occupying space without truly inhabiting it. This detachment, however, prevents any chance of genuine human connection, solidifying his isolation. The film suggests that true punishment is not suffering, but the slow, forced amputation of one's capacity for meaningful relationship. The final moments do not offer resolution, but a crystallization of the status quo. Gabriel performs a small, almost ritualistic act, perhaps extinguishing a light he had forgotten to turn off, or locking a door he had already checked 3 times. It is a gesture aimed not at security, but at imposing a final, tiny measure of control over his immediate shrinking environment. The camera holds on his face devoid of recognizable emotion, no fear, no sadness, only a profound emptiness. The white elephant is no longer a burden to be carried, but the very air he breathes, the undeniable, unchanging truth of his existence. The narrative concludes with the unsettling understanding that some cages are built entirely of silence and self-knowledge. The silence surrounding Gabriel is not empty. It is dense, saturated with the echoes of unspoken commitments and broken loyalties. He moves through his days like an archaeologist excavating his own past, careful not to disturb the fragile layers of his current, fabricated existence. His relationship with time has warped. Minutes stretch into eternities of tense waiting, while entire weeks seem to vanish in a blur of hyper-vigilant avoidance. This temporal distortion is a classic symptom depicted in psychological dramas where reality itself becomes suspect, perhaps an homage to the slow-burn tension favored by European auteurs focused on existential dread. His physical environment reflects this internal state. Every object in his apartment is scrutinized. A misplaced book or a slightly crooked picture frame becomes a potential signpost, a piece of evidence pointing back to the night everything dissolved. He avoids owning anything new, fearing that an untraceable purchase could create a new, unaccounted-for variable in the equation of his survival. This obsessive minimalism is a direct contradiction of the material success he once sought during his executive days, where acquisition was synonymous with achievement. The memory of Michael resurfaces not as a friend, but as a cautionary tale in physical capability. Gabriel occasionally catches himself mirroring Michael's posture. The slight forward lean, the way he held his hands loosely at his sides, ready for sudden movement. It is an involuntary homage to the only man who seemed truly adapted to the brutal logic of their shared endeavor. Yet Michael's survival technique, total severance, remains unattainable for Gabriel, who is still too tethered to the need for some form of recognizable context, however corrupted. David's fate serves as a constant, spectral reminder of youthful folly intersecting with adult danger. Gabriel imagines David, so eager to prove himself, so clearly out of his depth, suffering a humiliating, messy end, far from the clean, clinical endings the higher powers preferred. This imagined scenario allows Gabriel a perverse sense of superiority, a small comfort derived from his own slightly longer endurance. It is a dark reflection of competitive ambition, warped by shared trauma. The white elephant is now so integrated into Gabriel's psyche that he can no longer articulate what life was like before it. The memory of genuine, unburdened laughter feels alien, like something belonging to a character in a film he once saw. His attempts at maintaining his former career facade, perhaps dabbling in obscure consulting work that requires minimal human contact, are futile. The inherent distrust in his eyes poisons every proposal. The film suggests that the most effective form of punishment is not external force, but the successful internal reprogramming of the subject until they become their own most effective warden. The concluding imagery focuses intensely on sensory deprivation as a form of self-soothing. Gabriel sits in near darkness, letting the background noise of the city, the distant siren, the rumble of a late truck, wash over him. He is waiting for nothing in particular, having learned that anticipation is the only reliable constant. The narrative closes by focusing on his hands, still and steady, finally achieving the perfect stillness that signifies not resolution or acceptance, but the total cessation of internal struggle due to sheer overwhelming attrition. The silence that finally envelops him is not peaceful. It is the silence of the tomb, meticulously maintained from within. The stillness Gabriel achieves is not peace, but the final, terrifying equilibrium reached when all possible avenues for deviation have been exhausted. He has successfully engineered a life devoid of external markers, where every day is a carbon copy of the last, a deliberate flatness designed to appear beneath the notice of any calculating observer. This stasis is perhaps the truest homage to the minimalist thrillers that valued lingering shots of barren landscapes over explosive set pieces. The landscape here is internal, and it is utterly barren. His former professional life, characterized by the rapid ascent and the intoxicating belief in one's own strategic brilliance, now seems like a fever dream. He recalls vividly the boardroom presentations, the confidence in his own voice when dissecting market vulnerabilities. Now, the only market he analyzes is his own immediate vicinity, searching for anomalies that might signal imminent discovery. This preoccupation is a perverse manifestation of his old skills. The tools remain sharp, but the only thing left to dissect is his own fragile existence. The memory of Michael surfaces most often when Gabriel encounters situations demanding immediate, cold calculation. He observes other people making clumsy, emotional decisions in traffic or during minor disputes, and a familiar, chilling clarity washes over him, the kind Michael always possessed. It is a ghostly influence, a reminder that a part of him had been trained, perhaps permanently, to prioritize brutal efficacy over human empathy. Gabriel recognizes that Michael, by successfully disappearing, achieved the only form of victory available in their poisoned hierarchy. David remains the painful, unresolved note. Gabriel sometimes wonders if David, in his desperation, managed to pass the burden, the literal or metaphorical white elephant, onto someone else before he was neutralized. This thought provides a fleeting, almost manic burst of energy, quickly followed by crushing self-reproach for harboring such a selfish hope. David represented the last tether to the possibility of uncorrupted aspiration, and his loss confirms for Gabriel that the system consumes even the well-intentioned, albeit naive. The film underscores the corrosive nature of shared secrecy through the gradual degradation of Gabriel's inner monologue. It is no longer a coherent narrative, but a series of disconnected, defensive observations. He stops framing things as "I think" or "I feel," defaulting instead to impersonal statements of observation, "the light shifts," or "the floorboards creak." This linguistic devolution suggests a man actively shedding the parts of himself that require subjectivity and emotional engagement. In the final moments, the camera lingers on the pristine emptiness of his living space. There are no grand gestures of escape or dramatic confessions. Instead, Gabriel simply sits, completely still, the only movement being the slight, shallow rise and fall of his chest. The soundtrack fades almost entirely, leaving only the high-frequency ringing of tinnitus, the sound of a nervous system pushed past its breaking point and settling into a permanent low-grade alarm. The white elephant has ceased to be an external object. It is the very silence that defines his remaining time, a monument to the transactions that left him alive but fundamentally defunct. The pervasive quietude that envelops Gabriel is less a sanctuary and more a perfectly calibrated sensory deprivation chamber designed by his own trauma. He has achieved a terrifying mastery over his immediate environment, reducing all external stimuli to a tolerable, almost imperceptible hum. This self-imposed austerity mirrors the visual language of stripped-down, post-war European cinema, where the starkness of the setting reflected the paucity of hope. He views his old life, the tailored suits, the quarterly reports, the pursuit of tangible success, as a vibrant, unbelievable fiction he once starred in. His few remaining habits are obsessive rituals aimed at maintaining the illusion of continuity. He measures his coffee grounds with a jeweler's precision, not for taste, but for the exact replication of a fixed variable. These small acts of control are the only territory he still commands, a pathetic compensation for the massive, chaotic loss of control that defined the central event. This clinging to minutiae speaks volumes about a man whose entire professional trajectory, perhaps in strategic planning or risk assessment, has violently inverted itself. The ghost of Michael remains a benchmark for successful self-erasure. Gabriel occasionally considers what Michael might be doing, some nameless efficient task in a place equally nameless, and finds a strange, cold comfort in that very blankness. Michael's existence proves that complete dissociation is possible. It is the ultimate freedom within their confinement. For Gabriel, however, the intellectual residue of his past, his capacity for complex analysis, keeps him shackled to the memory, preventing the clean break Michael achieved. David's absence continues to nag at the periphery of Gabriel's consciousness, not as guilt, but as an irritating loose end in a logical problem. He fixates momentarily on the idea that David, in his panicked state, might have left behind some symbolic object, a cheap photograph or a hastily written note, that has yet to surface. This fixation is dangerous precisely because it involves looking outward, reintroducing the external world into his carefully constructed vacuum. It is the intellectual equivalent of touching a live wire. The title object, the white elephant, has completed its transformation. It is no longer a secret, but a fundamental component of his new identity, like an unexpected organ that must be constantly monitored. Gabriel realizes that if he were ever to confess, the confession itself would feel alien, a performance for an audience that would never truly grasp the suffocating banality of the horror. The secret is too large to be contained by language. It exists in the space between breaths. The film's closing sequence refrains from any narrative climax. Gabriel is seen simply existing in the diffused light of a late afternoon. There is no final decision, no dramatic departure. He remains stationary, a fixture in his self-made purgatory. The implication is devastating. True consequence is not punishment delivered by external forces, but the quiet, indefinite sentence of carrying the weight of one's own irreversible choices. The camera lingers until the frame is nearly black, suggesting that the only true ending is the absorption into absolute shadow, a total surrender to the corrosive reality the film has meticulously documented. The descent into this self-imposed shadow is marked by a peculiar, almost spiritual resignation in Gabriel. He is no longer fighting the inertia, he is becoming it. His physical movements, once sharp and intentional, have softened into an economy of motion that suggests profound conservation of energy, a man hoarding the last drops of his vitality for the singular task of continuing to breathe. This slow deceleration is filmed with a reverence for stillness, borrowing from the pacing of contemplative, meditative cinema, where the lack of action is itself the central dramatic event. His attire is now exclusively neutral and functional, worn cottons or simple dark garments that seem designed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a conscious shedding of the tailored armor that once defined him. He rejects even the pretense of his former sophistication. This aesthetic choice mirrors a deeper rejection of the systems that valued appearance over substance. He has traded complexity for utter simplicity, though this simplicity is itself a high-maintenance burden. The memory of Michael is now stripped of its operational utility. It is reduced to a purely philosophical counterpoint. Gabriel sometimes contemplates Michael's complete lack of internal conflict, the man who could act without the crippling necessity of moral calculus. He envies this capability, recognizing it as a form of ultimate brutal freedom. Michael was the true product of the machine, perfectly lubricated and ready for constant use. Gabriel was merely a temporary, flawed interface. This envy is cold, devoid of affection, rooted only in the recognition of superior adaptation to a shared, ugly environment. David's fate remains the one fissure in Gabriel's carefully constructed detachment, precisely because David represented the possibility of breaking under pressure, a natural human reaction that Gabriel has managed to suppress. Gabriel occasionally imagines David's disorganized demise as a form of accidental honesty, a messy truth that at least existed in the world, unlike Gabriel's own perfectly managed internal void. This contemplation borders on a dangerous desire for external discovery, a momentary, masochistic wish for the system to finally locate and classify him. The white elephant, having fully integrated, has begun to dictate the terms of his passive existence. Gabriel finds himself drawn to specific times of day, the precise moment the sun hits a particular spot on the wall, or the exact second the city transit system pauses its evening rush, as if these external rhythms are the only reliable chronometers left. He no longer fears being found. He fears forgetting the rules of being invisible, fearing the slip-up that would force him back into a conscious, active role. The final image is not one of darkness, but of blinding, featureless light. Gabriel stands before a window, not looking out, but simply allowing the full, unfiltered daylight to wash over him. He is pale, almost translucent. The camera does not pan or zoom. It remains fixed, observing the non-event. The sound design confirms the total erosion of narrative tension. The high-pitched tinnitus has receded, replaced by a profound, absolute quiet, the kind of dead air that follows the detonation of a massive, silent bomb. Gabriel has not found peace, but has become the ultimate monument to complicity, a man who survived by successfully erasing every reason for living, achieving a state of permanent, living obsolescence. The 2022 film White Elephant, helmed by director Michael Rooker, offers a surprisingly gritty and understated look at the moral compromises inherent in low-level criminal operations, specifically within the context of the Italian-American mafia structure. It is a narrative steeped in the familiar tropes of the genre, yet it manages a certain weary authenticity, largely propelled by the committed performances of its leads, Michael Rooker himself and Bruce Willis. The film operates less as a bombastic crime epic and more as a slow-burn character study about loyalty, aging, and the suffocating nature of a life lived outside the law. Rooker, whose career has spanned decades, often excelling in roles that portray complex, morally ambiguous figures. Think of his memorable turn as Merle Dixon in The Walking Dead or his earlier iconic performance in Henry. Portrait of a Serial Killer, brings a palpable sense of lived-in weariness to his character, Gabriel Tancredi. Gabriel is not the ambitious young hotshot. He is the middle management enforcer, nearing the end of his useful tenure, desperate to maintain relevance while quietly grappling with the implications of his life choices. His performance benefits immensely from Rooker's naturalistic delivery, which eschews theatricality for a kind of tired, professional menace. The central conflict arises from a seemingly routine hit gone wrong, forcing Gabriel to choose between his strict adherence to the mob's code and a flicker of genuine human empathy. This choice is the fulcrum upon which the entire drama balances. The film consciously avoids the slick, almost glamorous portrayal of organized crime often seen in mainstream cinema. Instead, the setting feels claustrophobic, the dialogue clipped, and the violence sudden and messy, suggesting that this life is more about tedious administration of threats than grand schemes. Bruce Willis, in one of his later screen appearances, plays Arnold Saletti, the shadowy, almost mythical figure to whom Gabriel reports. Willis, whose iconic roles, from the resourceful John McClane in the Die Hard series to his collaborations with M. Night Shyamalan, often centered on characters forced into extraordinary circumstances, plays Saletti with a subdued, almost detached authority. Here, he represents the establishment that Gabriel serves, a figure of unquestioned power whose motivations remain largely opaque until the final act. The dynamic between Rooker's desperate pragmatism and Willis's calm, immutable power structure forms the film's core tension. Thematically, White Elephant leans heavily into the concept of the obsolete tool. The white elephant itself, in this context, refers not to a physical object of burdensome value, but to the aging criminal whose capacity for unquestioning brutality is beginning to wane. Gabriel is wrestling with the realization that the system he has faithfully served views him as disposable the moment his effectiveness is compromised. This resonates with the common cinematic exploration of the working stiff, even one whose work happens to be murder, seeking some form of meaningful exit or legacy. Director Rooker seems keenly aware of the cinematic lineage he is tapping into, drawing inspiration from classic noir and the more grounded gangster pictures of the late 1970s and early 1980s, films that prioritized character psychology over elaborate plotting. The pacing reflects this homage. It is deliberate, allowing the weight of Gabriel's predicament to settle upon the viewer. While the film may not reach the heights of its cinematic ancestors, its commitment to portraying the internal erosion caused by a life of violence gives it a certain grim integrity. The final decisions Gabriel makes are less about heroic redemption and more about self-preservation under impossible constraints, a fittingly bleak resolution for a story about men trapped by their own past allegiances. The narrative's emotional texture is primarily one of resignation. Gabriel Tancredi moves through the dimly lit, unglamorous settings of his world, dingy backrooms, sterile meeting places, with the slumped posture of a man perpetually bracing for the next unpleasant task. His internal life, sparingly revealed through close-ups, suggests a deep-seated exhaustion that physical rest cannot cure. This exhaustion contrasts sharply with the required alertness of his profession. Rooker masterfully conveys the irony that a life dedicated to enforcing rigid order externally has resulted in complete internal chaos for his character. He is a man whose entire identity is fused with the machine, and the suggestion that the machine might discard him is an existential threat far greater than any police raid. The film wisely chooses to focus on the corrosive nature of loyalty when it demands the sacrifice of one's conscience. The inciting incident, the botched hit, is not treated as a moment of grand moral awakening, but as a bureaucratic headache that escalates into a catastrophe. Gabriel's subsequent actions are driven less by a sudden influx of morality and more by the logistical nightmare of covering his tracks and protecting his tenuous position. His emotional responses are muted. Panic is replaced by a cold, methodical need to manage the crisis, a testament to years spent suppressing natural human reactions in favor of professional expediency. Arnold Saletti, as played by Willis, serves as the immovable object against Gabriel's slightly less immovable force. Willis projects an almost grandfatherly calmness that makes his capacity for ruthlessness even more chilling. Unlike some crime bosses in film who project volatility, Saletti's power emanates from an absolute certainty in his own authority. He doesn't need to shout. His presence is enough to dictate the terms of life and death. This performance style, favoring stillness over histrionics, works well as a counterpoint to Rooker's more outwardly burdened portrayal of the foot soldier. Saletti represents the immutable contract of the criminal life. Servitude in exchange for protection, a contract that always defaults to the favor of the house. Furthermore, the supporting characters, though lightly sketched, reinforce the film's atmosphere of inescapable routine. They are functionaries, each playing their part without apparent reflection, highlighting how insulated Gabriel becomes by his elevated, albeit precarious, status. The world outside the organization is barely acknowledged, emphasizing the hermetic, self-contained nature of their existence. When one of these figures reacts poorly or deviates, the swift and often brutal correction serves as a harsh reminder of the rules Gabriel is now dangerously close to breaking. The visual language employed by the filmmakers supports this grim tone. Cinematography often utilizes deep shadows and muted color palettes, visually mimicking the moral landscape of the characters. There is very little daylight, suggesting that true clarity or innocence is inaccessible. The entire film feels perpetually late at night, the time when compromises are made and the true cost of the day's actions begins to settle heavily upon the participants. White Elephant ultimately functions as a cautionary tale, not about the allure of crime, but about the terrifying reality of obsolescence within a system that values utility above all else, leaving its characters stranded in a moral twilight zone of their own making. The film's refusal to inject overt heroism into Gabriel's plight is perhaps its most commendable narrative choice. We are not invited to root for his salvation in a conventional sense, but rather to observe his slow, agonizing realization of his predicament. His internal struggle manifests not as dramatic soul-searching, but as a tightening around the eyes, a subtle quickening of breath when an unexpected knock sounds at the door. Rooker understands that a man who has spent decades burying his conscience doesn't suddenly excavate it for a climatic moral stand. He tries to manage the symptoms. His decision-making process is rooted in damage control, a continuation of the professional mindset applied to a personal crisis. This adherence to the mundane reality of criminality, the paperwork of violence, keeps the narrative grounded, avoiding the glossy escapism that often sanitizes the genre. This grounding is essential when contrasting Gabriel with the figures of untouchable authority like Soletti. Willis embodies the ultimate detachment required to command such an operation. His few scenes are marked by an unnerving economy of movement and speech. For a star whose fame was built on charismatic, fast-talking leads, this deliberate minimalism suggests a character who has risen above the need for performance. Soletti exists in a realm where actions speak so loudly that words are rendered unnecessary. He is the ultimate product of the system Gabriel fears becoming obsolete within. The emotional chasm between the two men, one vibrating with suppressed anxiety, the other utterly placid, underscores the hierarchy of consequence within their organization. Gabriel pays for mistakes with his life. Soletti only pays with organizational realignment. The setting itself acts as a secondary antagonist. The environments are never grand. They are functional, temporary spaces that offer no comfort or permanence. This lack of aesthetic appeal reinforces the idea that this life is not about luxury or status, but about the grim execution of delegated tasks. Even the violence, when it occurs, lacks any choreographed beauty. It is quick, clumsy, and immediately followed by the awkward logistics of cleanup, the emotional toll of disposing of evidence mirroring the emotional toll of disposing of one's own decency. Ultimately, White Elephant explores the specific tragedy of the career criminal who understands the rules intimately but fails to grasp the unwritten final rule: everyone is replaceable. Gabriel's tragedy is intellectual. He recognizes the mechanics of his impending doom long before the executioners arrive. Rooker's direction, informed by his own long career spent observing and playing outsiders, imbues the film with a sympathetic understanding for the foot soldier who realizes too late that his loyalty was only ever conditional upon his immediate utility. The film leaves the viewer with the unsettling quiet that follows a system snapping back into rigid order, the discarded piece swept away without fanfare. The very structure of the film mirrors the bureaucratic nightmare Gabriel is trapped within. Exposition is delivered in clipped sentences during rushed meetings, emphasizing efficiency over emotional context. There is a notable absence of sentimental flashbacks or clear narratives detailing why Gabriel chose this life decades ago. This narrative omission is crucial. It suggests that the past is irrelevant, or perhaps so deeply buried under layers of transgression that excavating it would only hasten his downfall. The film focuses entirely on the immediate, the next necessary step to survive the current crisis, trapping the audience in the same suffocating present moment as the protagonist. This creates a sense of narrative claustrophobia, where forward momentum is always tempered by the fear of looking backward or pausing for reflection. This thematic commitment to the inescapable present is what distinguishes White Elephant from more romanticized gangster narratives. There is no talk of retirement, no secret stash of money waiting in the tropics. The only future available to Gabriel seems to be either continued, increasingly risky service, or immediate, violent cessation. This existential trap is deeply felt in Rooker's physical performance. The way he holds his shoulders slightly hunched, as if perpetually guarding against blows from unseen angles, speaks volumes about a life spent anticipating betrayal. He is less a man in control of his destiny and more a highly specialized machine awaiting its scheduled maintenance or inevitable scrapping. The interactions with peripheral characters further illustrate the crushing conformity required by the organization. Associates treat each other with a wary professional distance, revealing nothing personal, reinforcing the idea that emotional connection is a critical vulnerability. When Gabriel does attempt to express genuine concern or seek counsel, the response is invariably transactional, a demand for action or a veiled threat to ensure compliance. This ecosystem of guarded communication highlights the profound loneliness inherent in high-stakes, illicit careers. Success requires the constant, exhausting performance of emotional unavailability. The rare moments of levity feel forced, almost desperate attempts to simulate normalcy that quickly dissolve back into the prevailing atmosphere of suspicion. The film thus becomes a study not just of organized crime, but of an intensely dysfunctional corporate environment where the quarterly review might involve a bullet, and the performance metrics are measured in silence and obedience. The film's aesthetic choices consistently undercut any potential for grandeur, anchoring the viewer firmly in the mundane reality of mid-level criminality. The interior design, where scenes predominantly unfold, favors drab concrete and institutional beige over rich mahogany and opulent displays of wealth. This visual austerity speaks volumes about the hierarchy. The true power brokers, like Soletti, operate in spaces of implied untouchability, whereas men like Gabriel exist in the functional, often temporary staging grounds of the operation. These settings are designed for transaction, not habitation, reflecting the character's own transient existence within the structure. The light sources are typically harsh fluorescents or weak, yellowed lamps, casting long, unforgiving shadows that seem to externalize the character's moral compromises. Gabriel's relationship with violence is portrayed with a palpable lack of satisfaction. Unlike characters in other films who exhibit a thrill or mastery over weaponry, Gabriel handles tasks with the weary efficiency of a plumber fixing a chronic leak. His skill set is specialized and therefore highly marketable within this closed system, but it brings him no personal fulfillment. We witness moments where the necessity of violence forces a momentary pause, a slight hesitation that Rooker plays beautifully, not as fear of the act itself, but as a fleeting recognition of the cost incurred against his own remaining humanity. It is the exhaustion of having to perform cruelty on demand, day after day, that weighs him down more than the fear of retribution from his superiors. Soletti's measured stillness serves as a constant, almost psychological pressure point for Gabriel. Willis's performance relies heavily on subtext. A slight tilt of the head, an unwavering gaze, conveys volumes of unspoken threat. This lack of overt anger is far more terrifying than any outburst because it suggests a complete absence of emotional investment in the outcomes. Soletti is not angry at Gabriel's failure. He is merely assessing an inventory malfunction. This contrast highlights the cold logic that underpins the entire enterprise. Morality is irrelevant. Only systemic failure matters. When Gabriel finally makes his pivotal choices, they are framed not as moments of moral clarity, but as the only logical moves left on a board where all the squares have been predetermined by Soletti's silent authority. The film thus becomes a chilling meditation on how systems, once fully internalized, strip away the very capacity for self-directed choice, leaving the individual to merely react within increasingly narrow parameters until the system decides the reaction is no longer necessary. The pervasive sense of fatalism hanging over White Elephant is deeply embedded in the dialogue's sparseness. Conversations rarely serve to advance plot points overtly. Instead, they function as rituals confirming existing power dynamics or establishing alibis. Characters speak in a shorthand perfected over years of shared illegality, where implication carries more weight than explicit statement. This linguistic economy mirrors the organization's demand for streamlined function. No wasted energy on unnecessary discussion, just as no emotional energy is wasted on introspection. When Gabriel attempts to articulate his internal conflict, the language of his world immediately reasserts itself, forcing his concerns back into the rigid vocabulary of jobs, problems, and solutions, never touching on concepts like regret or peace. Rooker's directorial eye seems particularly attuned to the vulnerability hidden beneath the veneer of criminal competence. He frequently frames his characters in ways that emphasize entrapment, narrow hallways, doorways that seem too small, or interiors where the background seems to press in. Gabriel is rarely shown in open space, visually reinforcing the idea that his professional world has shrunk to the confines of his obligations. Even when alone, he seems physically constrained by the space he occupies, unable to stretch out or relax fully, perpetually poised for the next move dictated by unseen masters. The relationship dynamics outside the central duo offer minor yet potent illustrations of the system's toxicity. Any character who displays an excessive degree of emotion, whether uncontrolled fear or unwarranted ambition, is quickly neutralized or sidelined, serving as a cautionary tale for Gabriel. These minor figures demonstrate the terrifyingly low threshold for error within the mob structure. They function as living proof that Gabriel's cautious, weary professionalism is the only perceived path to temporary survival, yet even that path leads only to obsolescence, not freedom. The film suggests that true security is an illusion maintained only by perpetual, exhausting performance. In terms of thematic resonance, White Elephant owes a debt to the hard-boiled existentialism found in the works of writers who explored the futility of striving within corrupt, inescapable structures. The characters are not rebels fighting the system, they are cogs who have become painfully aware of their own wear and tear. Willis's Saletti embodies the calm, unfeeling embodiment of the system itself, a machine running perfectly, indifferent to the fate of its individual components. His power is the power of absolute adherence to the rules, even if those rules are unwritten. This narrative focus on internal decay rather than external confrontation gives the film its distinct, somber weight, leaving the audience with the chilling understanding that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not an outside rival, but the slow realization that you have faithfully served your own replacement. The psychological toll exacted by this life manifests subtly in the pacing of the film's key confrontations. When Gabriel is forced to make irreversible decisions, the camera lingers just long enough to register the micro-expressions of profound weariness, suggesting that the true weight of his actions is not guilt, but the sheer exhaustion of maintaining the facade. There's a sense that every successful act of violence further depletes his reserves, making the next inevitable act even harder to stomach, not morally, but physically. Rooker's direction avoids sensationalizing the pain. Instead, he focuses on the quiet fatigue that follows, the empty moment when the adrenaline fades and only the grim logistics remain. This lack of catharsis is central to the film's gritty realism. Saletti, conversely, seems entirely unburdened by the consequences of these actions. Willis's character seems to inhabit a different atmospheric pressure entirely. He is Teflon-coated against the emotional fallout. When he interacts with Gabriel, it's often through reflective surfaces, mirrors, polished tabletops, visually reinforcing his distance and untouchability. He is the ultimate administrator of consequence, rarely needing to physically touch the grime of execution. This directorial choice positions Saletti not merely as a boss, but as an abstract representation of institutional apathy, a force of nature rather than a man driven by petty greed or ambition. His stability becomes the most terrifying aspect of the narrative because it implies that the system itself is perfectly calibrated and requires no human empathy to function efficiently. The film's sound design further emphasizes this atmosphere of contained dread. Dialogue often takes place against a low, persistent background hum, the unseen machinery of their world still turning. Sudden silences in critical moments are more jarring than loud noises, signaling that the organization is listening, waiting for a definitive, compliant response. The ambient soundscape supports the visual confinement, ensuring that the viewer constantly feels the pressure cooker environment closing in on Gabriel. Ultimately, the tragedy of White Elephant lies in its depiction of a man who achieved a perverse form of success, loyalty earned through decades of unquestioning brutality, only to find that the highest virtue in this world is not loyalty, but flawless utility. Gabriel's final maneuvering is less a desperate bid for survival, and more a final, weary acknowledgement of the parameters of his cage. He plays the game to the very end, using the skills he honed for the mob to navigate his final doomed strategy. The film suggests that in this particular ecosystem, there is no external escape route. The only possible exit is the one dictated by the system itself, a conclusion arrived at not with a bang, but with the hollow echo of inevitable administrative closure. The film's muted color palette and preference for interior settings serve to effectively divorce the characters from any sense of normalcy or external accountability. The few instances where the characters step outside, briefly moving between vehicles or entering a dimly lit warehouse, feel like necessary logistical movements rather than opportunities for reflection or escape. The outside world, even when visible through a window, appears washed out, as if the vibrancy of ordinary life has been chemically bleached away by the character's profession. This visual language suggests that life outside the organization is no longer comprehensible or accessible to Gabriel. He is permanently conditioned to operate within the shadows and the transactional spaces designed for crime. Gabriel's internal conflict, while understated, finds its most potent expression in his reaction to unanticipated variables. When the botched hit introduces an element of uncontrolled chaos, the unexpected survivor or witness, Gabriel doesn't react with rage, but with a creeping sense of procedural horror. For a man whose existence is predicated on predictable outcomes and controlled engagements, the introduction of true randomness is more threatening than the known authority of Saletti. This forces him into improvisation, a skill set that Rooker implies is inherently inferior to rote obedience within the mob's rigid hierarchy. Improvisation suggests personality, and personality is a liability. Soletti's infrequent appearances are masterfully used to re-establish the immutable laws of their universe. Willis conveys that Saletti doesn't manage the organization through charisma, but through a kind of terrifying bureaucratic finality. There is no passion in his decision-making. There is only efficiency reports on human lives. When he communicates directives, they are presented not as harsh commands, but as necessary adjustments to maintain the overall health of the enterprise. This managerial approach to mayhem is arguably the film's most chilling commentary. Organized crime, when viewed from the top, is merely a complex, self-regulating business that demands the ruthless pruning of underperforming assets. The film is ultimately a sustained study in deferred reckoning. Gabriel has successfully deferred reckoning for decades by being exceptionally good at his job, but the system he serves is designed to eventually call in every debt. The White Elephant is not just the aging enforcer, but the lingering, unaddressed error that eventually becomes too costly to ignore. The narrative tension doesn't stem from if Gabriel will be caught by the police, but when the internal accounting will finally deem him unprofitable. This existential dread, played out across muted sets and through exhausted performances, solidifies White Elephant as a bleak meditation on the wages of professional loyalty in a world devoid of intrinsic value. The pervasive atmosphere of White Elephant is one of terminal inertia, where the protagonists are trapped not by external physical barriers, but by the momentum of their own compromised pasts. Gabriel Tancredi's movements suggest a man constantly fighting against the viscosity of his own history. Every decision feels like pushing against heavy, unseen resistance, a feeling intensified by Rooker's framing choices, which often place Gabriel slightly off-center, as if the frame itself cannot quite contain his unease. This visual instability contrasts sharply with Soletti, who is invariably centered, perfectly balanced, reflecting his alignment with the stable, if malignant, core of the organization. The concept of honor within this world is consistently shown to be a manufactured commodity, entirely conditional upon immediate returns. When Gabriel wavers or shows a flicker of doubt, it is immediately interpreted not as a moral failing, but as a potential breach of operational security. The film meticulously details the small ways in which the criminal life erodes personal capability. Gabriel's hands, often shown fiddling with keys or a cigarette, betray a nervous energy that his stoic facial expressions attempt to suppress. He is a highly trained professional whose tools, violence, intimidation, secrecy, are now turning inward, consuming the man who wielded them. Willis's subdued portrayal of Soletti demands that the audience fill in the blanks with their own worst assumptions about ruthless power. We never see Soletti sweat or raise his voice, yet his pronouncements carry absolute finality. This passive cruelty is perhaps the most insidious element of the film's depiction of organized power. It suggests that true control is achieved not through passion or anger, but through the cold, dispassionate application of policy, rendering the subordinates like Gabriel emotionally irrelevant to the outcome. Soletti operates on a plane where human emotion is simply an unpredictable variable to be managed, isolated, or eliminated. The score, when present, is minimal and dissonant, serving only to underscore moments of high anxiety rather than provide emotional scaffolding for the audience. This deliberate sonic austerity forces the viewer to rely entirely on the actor's nuanced performances to gauge the severity of the situation. The silence between lines of dialogue in crucial exchanges is loaded. It is the silence where men like Gabriel weigh decades of conditioning against a sudden, terrifying glimpse of potential freedom or absolute doom. White Elephant succeeds by refusing the temptation of genre uplift, instead providing a stark, almost anthropological examination of what happens when loyalty becomes an inescapable terminal diagnosis. The film's commitment to portraying the banality of deep-seated evil is further evidenced by the clothing and overall presentation of its characters. There are no sharp, tailored suits meant for impressing rivals or attracting media attention. Instead, the attire is functional, often nondescript: faded jackets, utilitarian shirts that blend into the background of nondescript diners or storage units. This sartorial choice underscores the operational nature of their existence. They are not gangsters playing at being businessmen, they are low-level functionaries executing tasks in the least conspicuous manner possible. Gabriel's wardrobe is the uniform of someone who needs to be ready for anything but seen by no one, further emphasizing his position as a disposable utility rather than a celebrated figurehead. This visual restraint extends to the handling of firearms and violence. When weapons are drawn, they are handled with a grim familiarity, devoid of the stylized reverence often seen in action cinema. They are tools for a messy job, not extensions of masculine ego. Rooker seems determined to strip the act of killing of any associated glamour, showing the immediate, awkward aftermath, the hurried cleanup, the forced composure required to transition back to routine interaction. This grounding in the unromantic logistics of crime reinforces the film's core message. This life is not glamorous, it is repetitive, exhausting labor punctuated by horrific necessity. Soletti's infrequent but crucial interactions with Gabriel often take place across substantial physical barriers, thick glass partitions in meeting rooms, or across large, empty tables. Willis exploits these visual separations to emphasize the unbridgeable gap in their social and hierarchical standing. Soletti is protected by architecture as much as by reputation. His voice, transmitted through an intercom or slightly muffled, sounds distant, almost spectral, suggesting that the man himself is secondary to the power he embodies. Gabriel must physically lean in, strain to hear, symbolizing his desperate effort to remain relevant to the power structure that already views him as peripheral. The subtle emotional landscape of resignation that defines Gabriel is also reflected in his consumption habits. He smokes not out of pleasure or rebellion, but seemingly out of necessity, a physical mechanism to occupy the hands and regulate the shallow, anxious breathing required to maintain his composure. These small, repeated actions become the entire vocabulary of his internal struggle, a quiet semaphore signaling distress that the external world is programmed to ignore. White Elephant thus functions as a slow-motion portrait of moral calcification, where the protagonist is less a tragic hero fighting fate and more an aging machine experiencing unavoidable systemic failure, ultimately awaiting the scheduled decommissioning by the very system he dedicated his deteriorating life to upholding. The narrative's exploration of loyalty is intrinsically tied to the theme of transactional reality, suggesting that in this milieu, trust is merely a temporary alignment of self-interest. Gabriel's entire career has been a testament to his reliability in executing distasteful necessities. Yet the moment his reliability is compromised by a human moment of hesitation, his value plummets. This rapid depreciation highlights the brutal algorithmic nature of the organization he serves. The film suggests that the mafia, stripped of its romanticized mystique, functions like any soulless corporation where past service holds no currency against current metrics of success. Gabriel's desperation is not rooted in a sudden moral awakening, but in the stark realization that he has no collateral outside of his utility, and that utility has expired. This transactional worldview is perfectly embodied by Soletti's utter lack of emotional response to human suffering. Willis's performance suggests a man who long ago outsourced his conscience to the bottom line. When Soletti addresses Gabriel's predicament, the dialogue is sterile, focusing solely on mitigating organizational risk. There is no shared history referenced, no nostalgic mention of past favors repaid, only the immediate threat assessment. This coldness validates Rooker's directorial decision to keep the emotional temperature low throughout the film. High emotion is viewed as inefficiency, a vulnerability that the system is designed to exploit and eliminate. The few scenes that hint at Gabriel's domestic life, or lack thereof, serve only to underscore his isolation. His world appears to consist solely of the operational space and the solitary moments between tasks, suggesting that his commitment to the life has effectively incinerated any capacity for genuine connection outside of it. He is a man whose identity is so thoroughly subsumed by his function that when the function is threatened, the man has nothing left to fall back on. This lack of personal anchorage makes his inevitable trajectory even more tragic. He is not just losing his livelihood, but his very definition of self. The visual metaphors employed continue to stress confinement. Even when moving between locations, the camera often captures the characters moving along the periphery of the frame, always near walls or edges, never inhabiting the center ground. This compositional choice visually affirms their status as necessary but ultimately peripheral players in the grander scheme, always one step removed from the true center of power, which remains safely sequestered and unseen, personified by Soletti's untouchable calm. White Elephant thus offers a grim perspective, that in a system built on ruthless exchange, the most loyal servant is